From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start, as we always do, with a check on the markets. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, it looks to me like the big news is the move in the 10-year yield spiking back up again. Equities are off, but not as much as I thought they might be.
Jittery day, and it has everything to do with rates rising, as you were just mentioning, David. That 10-year yield up about 9 basis points, approaching 1.5% again. Last week, we learned stocks just don't like the 10-year yield and yields at those levels, as they question whether it's not just the healthy reflation we've been looking at, as opposed to whether there's some inflationary causes. So earlier today in the pre-market, the NASDAQ 100 futures up 1% at the lows as those yields were really rising, down 1.6%. Right now, down 1%. And of course, tech taking the hit because rising yields, a repricing of risk, brings into question valuation. However, banks, the second best sector on the year, climbing on the day. The BKX index, KBW Bank index, up sharply. The financials, that's the second best sector for the day right now, up 1.7%, again, as yields are rising. As for that question of reflation or inflation, David, as you know, we were talking about this not so long ago, and it really does appear to be reflationary at this time as investors look forward to the reopening of the economy, stronger growth ahead, the idea that that's going to be absorbed. And the reason it looks reflationary right now, if you take a look on the year at energy and oil, those are both up. And you could make the case perhaps that's inflationary, but when you put gold into the picture, gold is down. That's an inflation hedge, so that's not showing any signs of inflation. And the dollar, if it was a runaway inflation situation, you would probably see the dollar down, whereas the dollar is higher on the year, and technical signs suggest that it may climb. But right now, it's as back and forth as stocks try to absorb this new rates regime, David.
Hey, Abigail, thank you so much for trying to sort out those somewhat conflicting signals. To Abigail Doolittle. The economy overall is recovering, albeit unevenly. And we just heard the bond market in particular is sending out some signals with those 10-year yields spiking back up near 150 basis points. The question is, what is all that telling us about the economy? For some answers, we welcome now Adam Posen. He is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Adam, it's such a delight to have you back with us. So we've really had almost nosebleed increases. The levels are not all that high, but goodness, they've moved up fast. Are they telling us something fundamental about the economy we should be paying attention to?
Thank you, David, for having me. And I'm actually along the same lines as the lead off your colleague, Abigail, just gave. This is more about the growth outlook and not so much about the inflation outlook. There's clearly some price of inflation risk in there, but I think you should view that as transitory. The change is people really believe that the pandemic will be ended with sufficient number and provision of vaccines. There are arguments why that may actually be premature, but that is a sufficient explanation for what's happening in the bond market.
Now, that's all before we get $1.9 trillion in additional fiscal stimulus, which is wending its way through Senate. Looks like we'll get some version of that. I don't know what the number will be exactly. Does that change the perspective at all? As you know, we have some economists like Larry Summers really worrying that we're really pumping a lot more money into the economy at a time that perhaps it doesn't need quite that much.
I think that Larry and my colleague at Peterson, Olivier Blanchard, have been making that case, are broadly right, that there's a huge chunk of the Biden Congress package that is probably overkill. The parts of the money going, which is roughly 70% of it, going to vaccine distribution, state and local governments, unemployment extensions, those are necessary things. Those will probably not have huge multiplier effects. And those, in some senses, are self-limiting. When you've given enough vaccines, that stops. When people stop being unemployed, they stop asking for the money. It's the direct transfers that are the problem. But I think we're more likely to see panic in the bond markets over potential inflation than lots of actual inflation. So the Fed is in a very awkward position.
Inflation expectations are moving up, though, aren't they? We saw it in the 5-year, for example.
Yeah, they are. But the first, we don't know how sustained that's going to be. Second, that the move up, as you pointed out, David, I mean, we're still at very low levels. I mean, we're essentially just cresting above the levels that the 10-year was before the pandemic hit. And historically, whether you look to 2008 or earlier, that's still quite low. And then third, I think there's a lot of room now for bond market volatility to rise. So the fact that we've seen this jump may lead to a series of jumps back and forth. It doesn't necessarily indicate an ongoing positive trend.
What about the unevenness that we hear about from so many people, including Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed? And I take it that both is unevenness with respect to individual sectors, such as travel and leisure, services industry getting left behind, but also in certain groups within the country, particularly parts of the minority groups are really being left behind, are really having it much harder than others. Is there anything that we can do about that?
You're absolutely right. And I think, frankly, Chair Powell and others' statements are much more about the human unevenness, the frontline workers, people of color, women who have to stay home or cope with children and parents who have needs, is much bigger issue of the unevenness than the sectors. We kind of expect, obviously, in hospitality and retail are hit disproportionately. What can be done? The Fed can't do much, except, as Powell and his colleagues keep emphasizing, trying to get back to a high pressure, high demand economy for labor, and we've got a lot of room to make up. There's a lot, however, the federal government can do if it chooses to change the tax code, which seems unlikely given the Senate right now, but there are things that can be done. There's various regulatory measures that President Biden is undertaking to increase the bargaining power of workers, including collective bargaining, including enforcement of regulations. And that will have some beneficial effect. But the biggest thing that can be done is to rethink how we look after, women and families, that even the bold steps on child poverty that we're seeing in the current package need to be matched by some longer term restructuring of greater support for families in need, greater support of flexible work arrangements for women, greater support for equality in pay.
Talk about the equality quest, because as you know, there now is a proposal, a bill in Congress on the wealth tax proposed by Elizabeth Warren, the senator, as well as Pramila Jayapal. I know that the Peterson Institute has done a lot of work on inequality, wealth and income inequality in this country. What do you make of the wealth tax?
Thank you for remembering our work, and I encourage your viewers to look at our microsite on what is inequality and how to fix it, which is meant as a public good. But in terms of the the wealth tax, apologize. That is something that tends to take on a religious tinge, and I don't think it's worth the religiosity about it. We have seen in democracies one-time solidarity or ongoing solidarity treatments. The classic example is after the unification of Germany, where it was a one-time but enormous shift, and people in the West paid a surcharge, a surtax, on top of their normal taxes for more than a decade to help bring together that society. And it was largely successful. So I think it's less necessarily about whether it's wealth or income, because as we know in the US, people like you and me are pretty high salary, not necessarily high wealth, but most people who have high income are also high wealth. So if you do a high income tax in a progressive way, that will take care of a lot of this. But the other point on inequality is some of it has to be addressed directly through the legal system, through enforcement of fair regulations, and through investment at early stages in people's career. I think the Biden team, led by the newly confirmed Cecilia Rouse as CEA chair, have a lot of positive ideas on this front. It's not all about taxes. Some of it has to be more directly intrusive.
Even within the realm of taxation, give us your sense about the trade-off between, on the one hand, a wealth tax, and on the other, just increasing the marginal rate on the more highly paid in the regular income tax.
The case on the wealth tax, David, first has to deal with there are constitutional arguments about why it would be difficult to impose. I don't think that should be the constraint, but it might be. So it may just not be worth the candle. In terms of the merits, there is a case that we've seen wealth accumulate so much in this society, and a lot of it is about a declining labor share, not about suddenly investors are much better than they used to be, or capital is that much more productive than it used to be. But in the end, most people who are benefiting from that very large wealth gain also have large amounts of income. And it's not like most people in the top income brackets are going to stop working if the tax rate becomes too high. The most important thing is, following the 2017 tax cuts and the previous rounds of tax cuts, the tax rates in the US are actually quite low by international standards and by historical standards. So we don't need to work too much that if we raise them, we'll get all kinds of bad disincentive effects. We just got to pay for what we're doing. And it's reasonable to ask people who've benefited so much in recent years to pay a greater share.
Okay, thank you so much. As I say, it's always a delight to have you with us, Adam. That's Adam Posen. He is the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Coming up, the fate of the stimulus package now that it's reached the Senate. From Mike Braun, he's Republican senator from Indiana. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Marc Crumpton.
David, thank you. The U.S. Senate may formally begin debate on the pandemic relief bill as soon as this afternoon. The House has already passed the measure. Now, a handful of moderate Democratic senators wants tighter targeting for jobless aid and stimulus checks. The Biden administration isn't counting on any support, so it needs all 50 Democrats on board. ADP says American companies added a less than expected 117,000 jobs last month. The survey had called for 205,000. That underscores the labor market's struggles to recover despite a decline in coronavirus infections the last few weeks. The government comes out with the February jobs report on Friday. Today, 2 Senate committees will question federal officials about why it took so long to deploy the National Guard during the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. Among those testifying, the commander of the District of Columbia's Guard unit, along with experts from the Pentagon, FBI, and Homeland Security. Last week, the former Capitol Police Chief said the Guard didn't arrive for more than 4 hours after he asked for them. The Tokyo Olympics organizers say a decision will be made by March 25th whether to allow overseas spectators. They'll decide whether there will be limits on Japanese fans in April. Earlier, the Mainichi newspaper reported that foreign spectators would be banned from the games. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Marc Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Marc. Well, as Marc just reported, the Senate is due to start debate on the Biden $1.9 trillion stimulus proposal today, with the focus largely on whether the Democrats can hold on to every single one of their 50 votes in order to get it through. Welcome now someone from the other side of the aisle, Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana. Senator, it's always great to have you with us. Give us your viewpoint from your side of the aisle. Do you have a role at this point? Can you have some influence to change this legislation, understanding you may well not vote for it in the end?
Well, sadly, we're mostly along for the ride, and it's going to be dependent on how many moderate Democrats are still left that represent states like West Virginia, maybe Arizona, Colorado. There is so much in this bill that has nothing to do with COVID. Ron Johnson, just for sake of kind of describing what this is about, if you took $1.9 trillion bills, he came up with it, you get halfway to the moon. It's a lot of money that we haven't spent $1 trillion of the $4 trillion that we've already done. The prior 5 packages, when we were in control, all had nearly unanimous support, very bipartisan. I think what's going to happen here is we're going through an exercise probably starting Thursday evening. We that are fiscal conservatives are going to belabor it more than the kind of warm-up we did a couple weeks ago and have to point it out. Obviously, we're borrowing every penny of it, whether you're a believer in modern monetary theory or not. You've even got guys like Larry Summers, Steve Radner, a lot of moderate liberal economists that wonder how you can do this. So it's going to be mostly up to 2 or 3 Democrats to see if you can take these stimulus checks, aim them at the most needy. I'd even be for maybe a little more if it was somebody still didn't have a job and would be at the lowest income levels, but they're expanding eligibility. When I go back to Indiana, the biggest thing I hear, we're nearly back to full employment. That if you put a $400 enhanced unemployment benefit out there, it's going to prolong getting people back to work. So a lot of common sense arguments that I think the Dems are going to have trouble justifying. Sadly, if they want to, they control the votes, they can ram it through.
Okay, just to interrupt for one moment, excuse me, Senator, we do have some news breaking across the Bloomberg, which is that the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo, will hold a news conference at 1 p.m. Eastern time. As we know, we've not heard from him since that scandal, I think it's fair to call it, developed with respect to 3 women who had allegations about him. So there is a news conference coming up from Governor Cuomo at 1 o'clock Eastern time. I apologize, Senator Braun. Let's come back to you.
Hey, no problem.
Give me a sense of, if it were really targeted, what do we truly need?
Okay, so not too long ago, 10 Republicans went over and offered $618 billion. Billions get thrown around like chump change currently because, you know, trillions seem to be the new level that you got to spend. If you really targeted it, take what's in the bill, which most analysts say 10%. So that's about $200 billion if you want to aim it at COVID. Then you can start peeling off all the rest of the stuff and either tailor it to what places need. You pulled the minimum wage out because it was not germane. I think we might talk about that in a moment. But it depends mostly what kind of shape your economies were in pre-COVID. I come from the street of running a business for 37 years before becoming a senator. Hottest economy we ever had was actually raising wages in the most difficult spots and kept some of these needed regulations in place, but rolled back a lot of the stuff that was impeding growth. Coming off an economy that was growing faster in the tail end of the recovery than the Obama-Biden years tells you something. So California, places that had blanket, policies fighting COVID, shutdowns that were broad and deep. Places like Indiana that paid attention to the guidelines, a little more entrepreneurial on the economic side of it. Like I said, we're back to nearly full employment. That part, the big giveaway to places that had bad business climates, not robust state economies to begin with, are going to benefit mostly from it, and that's rewarding, I think, bad policy. So I think it's somewhere between 200 to 300 billion, and look at what was proposed in the roughly 600 billion package. That would be plenty. I'm for helping restaurants. I'm for helping anybody that's still waylaid by it, but that increasingly would be a narrow sector: sports, entertainment venues, airlines, obviously. The one place that have gotten special help, downtown hotels would be in that category. Small businesses in general. Beyond that, most people I talk to back in Indiana are more worried about how to get people back to work than having competition from the federal government.
So, Senator, you mentioned your business background, having built a business. Yeah. I remember from prior discussions, you have a wife who also has a small business back in Indiana. Correct. Let's talk about that minimum wage that is not going to be now, and this package is wending its way through the Senate. Is there a way, in fact, that Republicans could come to support that? And let me go back to the last time it was raised. It was raised by Republicans during the George W. Bush administration. It was paired with, as I recall, tax breaks for small business because of the recognition that it hits small business harder. Is there something that could be done there in a separate bill at some point?
The minimum wage is so complex in the sense that when you get it too high, you're eliminating those kind of training wage jobs. You're eliminating certain sectors that have depended upon that entry-level employee. But currently it's $725. I think the federal poverty level is about $858. I've been a business owner that has always viewed raising wages as a key thing you need to do to keep good people around. Of course, that's done through the marketplace. If you were really looking at minimum wage, you would index it by cost of living across the country. You can make the argument in New York City, Seattle, San Francisco, you need a wage above 15 bucks. Why aren't they doing that now? Or when you trot out like Costco or Amazon, who brag about a $15 wage, maybe that needs to be more. But if you do a one-size-fits-all, you're going to eliminate over 1 million jobs. You're not going to acknowledge that the cost of living in places like Indiana and many of the states way lower. So if you did it smart, you acknowledge the difference between a training wage and a full-time wage, you'd get people like me that look at things a little more critically that might be interested, making sure you don't take any wage level that you would set that would raise it above where it needs to be by a state that's got value because you have lower costs there.
Okay, Senator, it's always terrific to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Senator Mike Braun. He's a Republican of Indiana. Coming up, we are going to take a look at the UK budget that was announced earlier today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's Rishi Sunak, presented his budget earlier today for the United Kingdom. And here to take us through it is our colleague in London, Emma Chandra.
Thank you very much, David. And the Chancellor now speaking again at a press conference from Downing Street. But he spoke earlier to Parliament outlining that budget. And we really saw Rishi Sunak trying to balance two competing needs. The first, of course, to continue to support the UK economy ravaged by the pandemic, like many other nations. And the second, of course, how it will deal with reining in the deficit in the coming years. But let's deal with the first of those, the Chancellor repeating his phrase to do whatever it takes to support the economy. That, of course, borrowed from Mario Draghi. And we saw the focus on the furlough. That's the marquee scheme where the government pays 80% of the wages of employees up to £2,500. That will be extended through to September. It had been due to expire in April, and a number of other schemes to support employees and businesses also being extended. Now, the second side of the coin is taxation, how to pay for that. We're talking about corporation tax. That's what the Chancellor is saying he will increase. It will be going from 19% to 25%, but not until 2023, so 2 years from now. And the reason the Chancellor thinks he can get away with this whilst keeping the UK competitive, especially in a post-Brexit world, is that corporation tax in the UK is actually quite low compared to other countries. And even with this rise to some 25%, it will still be the lowest among G7 countries. So he's betting that companies aren't going to leave the UK or be put off from leaving the UK. He also added a sweetener, something called the super deduction. Well, they'll be allowed to deduct investments into their businesses from their taxable profits, David.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fascinating, Emma. They do realize they have a big bill they're going to have to pay, and it looks like they're going to do it by raising corporate taxes. Thank you so much to Emma Chandra, our colleague in London. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Marc Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. President Biden wants to speed up the timetable for most Americans to be vaccinated. He says there will be enough doses for all American adults by the end of May, and he wants states to give teachers and child care workers priority. The president wants them to get at least one dose of the vaccine by the end of this month. More problems for New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Legislative leaders have agreed to curb his pandemic-related emergency powers. That comes on top of calls for the governor to resign. He's facing an investigation into claims that he acted inappropriately toward 3 women. Plus, there are questions whether his administration covered up data on coronavirus deaths in nursing homes. As David Weston told you moments ago, the governor is scheduled to hold a press briefing this afternoon. Samsung has outlined plans for a $17 billion semiconductor factory in the United States. The plans were filed with the Texas government, although Samsung also is considering sites in Arizona and New York. The South Korean company is trying to win more American clients and narrow the gap with industry leader Taiwan Semiconductor. Hong Kong has made its 100th arrest under a national security law imposed on the former British colony by China last year. More than half of those arrests came in January when 55 opposition figures were taken into custody. They had taken part in an unofficial primary election and were accused of trying to gain a majority in the legislature to paralyze government. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Marc Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Overnight, 10 rockets were fired on an air base in western Iraq used by U.S.-led coalition troops. There were no casualties and no material damage, but it does continue a series of attacks and counterattacks in the region. To give us a broader perspective on what's going on, we welcome now Kori Schake. She is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Earlier, Ms. Schake served on the National Security Council and in the State Department of President George W. Bush. So, Ms. Schake, thank you so much for joining us. Is there a broader perspective here? Because we had the attack from the Biden administration, a missile strike in eastern Syria earlier. We also had a mine attached to a ship, an ocean-going ship in the Gulf over there. What's going on?
Well, the Iranians are trying to shape how all of us approach the return to negotiations over the restrictions on their nuclear weapons program. And they are trying to show that they are a major regional power and that the United States can be pushed aside in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and in the Gulf. And the Biden administration, as the Trump administration before it, tried to send a signal early with its retaliation for an earlier Iranian attack by hitting Iranian facilities in Syria. And this is Iran showing that they can and will target American forces stationed in Iraq, hoping to precipitate a disproportionate American response or to cause us to make choices that aggravate our relationship with the Iraqis. Because what the Iranians would like more than probably anything else regionally is to chase the United States out of its partnership with Iraq.
So this could have kinetic, as they say, responses, but if it's really about the negotiation, does it serve the Iranians' purposes? Because one of the issues is whether their support of these surrogate groups, militia and otherwise, in the region should be in the agreement or not. It wasn't in the original JCPOA. The more they do this, doesn't it indicate that really we need to have that as part of the agreement?
Well, we may need to have it, but we have no ability to get it. That's the problem. Right? The Obama administration focused narrowly on the Iranian nuclear weapons program because it was something the United States cared about, although countries in the region, exactly as you suggest, David, care a lot more about Iranian efforts to destabilize their societies, to foment sectarian friction, and to delegitimize the governments themselves.
Another pressing issue in the region is Saudi Arabia, as we had that release of an intelligence report from the United States government really saying that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman knew about what was going on and approved it. Having said that, do we have any choice but to take some action sanctioning it? Can we just let that sit out there?
Well, the Biden administration did sanction, I think, 17 Saudi officials, which will make it more difficult for the Crown Prince to find domestic partners for things he may want to do that the United States won't want. I think you've also seen the Saudi government release domestic political activists, like women's rights activists, in the hope that they can pick up some ground with the Biden administration, which is trying to put human rights and democratic advance more in the center of American policy than had been true. So I was hesitant to think they should sanction Mohammed bin Salman directly because he is going to be the head of state of Saudi Arabia for probably 50 years. And if we sanction a head of state, why Saudi Arabia but not China, not Russia, not lots of other potential contenders whom we ought to have diplomatic relations with because we have interests we want to work on with them and against them?
Kori, I'd like to turn to politics, which you might think is not directly related to national security or to foreign policy. But you wrote what I found a fascinating piece in The Atlantic, basically saying, if I can paraphrase, maybe not do it justice, security begins at home. And when we have extreme partisan divides, as I understood what you were saying here in the United States, it undermines our ability to deal with both friends and foes overseas. How does that work?
Well, for example, the Iranian nuclear weapons agreement is a perfect test case, right? Because the Obama entered into it without creating a treaty basis that would require ratification by the Senate, instead taking a series of executive actions that the Trump administration immediately overturned, and that the Biden administration is looking to overturn yet again. So the reliability of the United States as a partner for our adversaries like Iran, but also for our friends. The Obama administration joined the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. The Trump administration pulled out of it. The Biden administration, while I think pretty protectionist on trade policy, is looking for some way to rejoin trade partnership with the countries of the Pacific, if for nothing else than for the strategic leverage in managing a rising China. So the back and forth between administrations, when politics doesn't stop at the water's edge, drives up the cost to the United States of agreements we want to make internationally.
Okay, it's really a delight to have you with us. Thank you very much. It's Kori Schake. She is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Coming up, Texas lifts its pandemic restrictions, saying it's time to get back to normal. We talk with Dr. Marc Boom, Houston Methodist President and CEO, about whether the move is justified by the science. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Texas Governor Greg Abbott has lifted the mandate to wear masks along with other restrictions to fight the pandemic, saying it was, quote, time to open Texas 100%. Is he right, or is he underestimating the risks that are still out there? We welcome now Dr. Marc Boom. He is president and CEO of Houston Methodist, whose flagship hospital has been ranked as the #1 hospital in Texas for 8 years in a row. Dr. Boom, thank you so much. Can't say that too often. Really great to have you with us. So give us your review of what your governor has done. Is he right?
Well, it's what we've been saying to everybody, really, even long before that order was made yesterday, is give us about 90 to 120 days. I see sort of Independence Day, the 4th of July, as a real target date for us to achieve, not independence in the sense of 1776, we were instantly independent. We had to fight for it still after that, but a point where we can get to a period that's almost normal. So we really need to wear masks through that point in time. One of the things Governor Abbott said is while he was lifting the mandate, it didn't change people's personal responsibility to wear a mask. And I couldn't agree with him more in that latter part of the statement. We really need everybody to wear a mask. And I actually think the end is getting closer in sight. We've got a lot of really positive data in terms of vaccine supply, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of immunity that emerges. We just got to hang in there, for this next kind of 90 to 100 days or so. And I think we're going to see a much better summer. Now, I'll caveat that with, if we have a mutant emerge or something that is worse than we see right now, which is always possible with so many people getting the virus, that could change. But if things continue on the path they're on today, if the supply comes in as has been promised and we can get people vaccinated, we're going to have a really much better back half of the year. Not normal yet, but so much better than it's been. And so we really just want people to hang in there for just a few more months.
Dr. Boom, I always love talking to you because you're not only a really respected scientist and physician, but you also are terribly reasonable, and you're always very gentle in what you say. But at the same time, to come back to Governor Abbott for a second, either what he said yesterday makes a difference or it doesn't. I understand he said you have a personal responsibility to wear a mask, but by saying we're going to lift the ban, doesn't that affect some people's behaviors, and shouldn't that give us some pause?
Yeah, I'm worried about the behavioral changes that happen. I think about last year when we opened back up Texas. And actually, I think opening back up at the time we did was the right thing. But along the way, the messaging got really muddy. And so people sort of heard this, hey, everything's okay, and then went about their business, and kind of had, celebrated over Memorial Day, and we paid the price with a big surge in the summer. I worry now that the clear-cut messaging all of us need to do, and it's why we're leaning so much into that, is keep wearing the mask. It may not be mandatory now, but keep wearing the mask through the next few months. And then actually we will be able to have some situations where we don't have to mask up as much. I mean, there's already situations now, for example, if you take a couple and two couples, and they're both fully vaccinated. And I mean, by fully vaccinated, they've gotten both their doses. They've waited a few weeks after that. We should be allowing those individuals to get together for dinner with without a mask and those things. So we've got to trust the vaccines, but we also got to give them enough time to work.
Give us a sense of the numbers, what's going on in your area there, Houston and the greater area around it. Nationwide, I think what happened is we had a big spike after the holidays. It came down, but then it sort of flattened out, that the curve is not keeping to go as steep. What are you seeing down there in Texas?
Yeah, we're seeing pretty similar numbers to that. We're down a little over 50% from our peak if I look at the hospitalizations, which, are a little bit of a lagging indicator. But they started to slow down. We got hit pretty hard, obviously, with the big Arctic storm. And so, that slowed some things down as well. We're still waiting to see, was the outcome of that actually good for the spread or bad for the spread of the virus? And I just don't know the answer to that yet. But it is going down slowly, but it is still going down. It's at a manageable level in our hospitals, but it's still well above 2x what we would see during a bad flu season. So there's still a lot of people in hospital. We're still admitting a lot of people. What I really want to make sure is that we all protect each other for these next 90 to 120 days, because when we do the numbers, if we get the vaccine that's supposed to be in, right, you're supposed to see 20 million doses now of J&J by the end of the month. We're starting to see supposedly 50 million doses a month of both Moderna and Pfizer starting by April. Really, we should be getting everybody vaccinated by the June timeframe, meaning they're immune, 4 to 6 weeks after. So really by that beginning of July, we could have everybody who wants to be vaccinated immune. When we look at the numbers, that's not enough for herd immunity for a couple of reasons. One is you've got 24% of the population is 18 and up. Only a sliver of that population is eligible for Pfizer. They're not eligible for the other two. So you start, with one hand tied behind your back because you can't vaccinate children yet. Hopefully that'll happen in the fall. And then we see at best probably 70-75% of adults saying they will get the vaccine. So we're not going to get there to herd immunity just by vaccinating. But when you start adding up the number of people in society who've been infected plus the number vaccinated, I don't think we're still going to quite get to herd immunity, but we're going to be approaching it. And so with some relatively low-level protections, we probably could get to a place where we're in some sort of rough, steady state with the virus. And we're going to live that way probably for several years, I suspect, after that. But things should be much better. So that's what we're crossing our fingers for. I caveat all of that with, if we have a terrible, variant emerge, that's a real problem. At Houston Methodist, actually, we've sequenced over 20,000 of the virus genomes so far. Because of that, we were the first city in the country to see every single variant in the city. I'm sure that's actually there in the others. They just haven't tested for it. We're in a race against time with those variants. And frankly, we're in a race to make sure other worse variants don't emerge. And the more people are infected, the more chance there is for that. So again, I'm very optimistic about where we're going to go, but we've got 90, 120 days where we really need to link arms and keep doing the right thing.
Doctor, talk about that percentage of the population that may be resistant to getting vaccinated. You have some experience down there. You and I have talked before about, for example, the staff of Houston Methodist. Some people think that as more people get vaccinated and people know people who've had it, that might go down. Do you see any evidence of that in your area?
Yes. Short answer is yes. Within the institution, we're well over 80%. Actually, we're over 81% of our staff now are vaccinated. That's honestly creeping up at this point. So we've got, the rest probably who are quite reluctant, and we're still working many strategies for that. But that's significantly higher than the percentages we see in surveys. And actually, if you look at the last few months of surveys of the general public, the number of people who say, hell no, I will never get vaccinated, really isn't moving. That's solidly 15+% of the population. But what we're seeing is far more people saying, I'm going to get vaccinated quickly, and fewer people, than coming from the, I want to wait a little bit while. So we're seeing kind of that move. And I think, just in the U.S. alone, obviously we've vaccinated about 80 million doses. At Houston Methodist, we'll do our 300,000th dose today, which is, a very prodigious number. These are amazingly safe. And if you do the math, 1 in 640 Americans or so died this past year from COVID. That is a horrific number. and puts it solidly as the number 3 cause of death.
Right.
When you look at that,
Right.
the vaccines are safe.
Right.
At worst case scenario, 1 in millions of problems. And so the math is easy. Get your vaccine.
It's important to keep that in mind. Thank you so much, Dr. Marc Boom. He is Houston Methodist President and CEO. Coming up, the White House looking to speed up the process for passing its stimulus package. Jared Bernstein of the White House Council of Economic Advisors will be joining us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Joe Biden is looking to speed up the passage of his COVID relief package by agreeing to narrow the eligibility for stimulus checks after a push from moderate Democratic senators. For more, we welcome now Jared Bernstein. He's member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So really appreciate you being with us, Dr. Bernstein. First of all, clarify, it is being reported, in fact, that we're going to change from 100,000 to 80,000, that cutoff level for the stimulus checks. Is that true or not?
It's not what I'm picking up. Now, sometimes I'm afraid I may lag the headlines, but I'm an economist in the White House, so I'm really focused on the economic rationale for the checks and for their targeting. And about that, let me say what I think is most important, and that's that President Biden has consistently and clearly been committed to getting money to people through this rescue plan as quickly as possible, to people who need it the most. And he wants to be sure that those dollars are targeted appropriately to families who are facing the most hardship. In his view, that's consistently been a threshold of $75,000 for single filers and $150,000 for joint filers. Now, we're going to continue to work with Congress on the details of this, but those are the thresholds that he's long stuck to. I think more important than the thresholds is maintaining the promise that families get $2,000 in direct impact payments, $600 from the December package, $1,400 from the American Rescue Plan. President Joe Biden has never wavered from that commitment, and he will stick to it until this is done.
Let me ask about another part of it, which is the assistance to state and local government. There's a Bloomberg report today that basically totaled up the total amount of revenue lost because of the pandemic and said that the nearly, I think, $200 billion in this package is something like 3 times as much revenue has been lost. How do you respond to that? Is it in fact possible that we're giving the states in this bill more than they need?
So let me respond by first of all saying that these revenue estimates can be kind of shaky. They lag. I've seen different ones from different sources. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities track this very closely, and they've most recently been closer to $300 billion. But I think when you just look at filling the revenue hole, you're missing something really important. 2 things, actually. First of all, the costs of doing one of the most important things in the American Rescue Plan, and that's finally gaining control of this virus, distributing the vaccine, getting it into folks' arms, and finally being able to launch a robust recovery, because we've done something that has heretofore not occurred, and that's deal COVID-19 a knockout punch. That's part 1. Part 2 is some of these states have laid off just many, really well over 1 million workers in the public sphere. Teachers, firefighters, cops, health workers, they've got to hire them back. And so you have to look at the cost side of the equation, not just the revenue side.
So, Jared, as you say, you're the economist. You're not the political guy. So you're not cutting the deal, presumably, with the Senate or with the House. But as an economist, when they turn to you in the White House and say, okay, how much can we give up and what do we absolutely have to have for the sake of the economy, what do you say is the key thing or things that just has to be there for it to be worth it?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and I think that there are. This is a sizable package, so there are a few things. I think what we talked about one already is the checks, $1,400 checks to Americans who've just been bearing the brunt of this crisis. In a couple of weeks, I don't know how many people are aware of this, but in less than 2 weeks, around 11 million Americans will start to lose unemployment benefits if we don't pass the American Rescue Plan. So a vote to extend and enhance unemployment assistance is crucial. We have to make sure that we keep people in their homes with adequate nutritional support. Research shows that folks on the bottom leg of the K in this unequal recovery, some folks doing well, other folks not doing well at all, still struggling. We need to make sure that we have anti-eviction and nutritional support in here. We have to make sure we do the virus part that I talked about, getting shots in arms. We have to provide businesses with the help they need to keep their doors open, and we can cut child poverty in half with the extension of the child tax credit in these reports. Now, if you do that, you get to 1.9 trillion, and that's the package that the president is working towards making an economic reality, as well he should.
Jared, one of the parts that apparently will not be in the Senate version is going to be that $15 minimum wage nationwide, because the parliamentarian in the Senate says you can't have it in there. But there's reports that it'll come back in some other guise. Give us your sense as an economist what that does to the economy. And most specifically, because last time it was raised by Republicans, they included with it some accommodation in taxes for small business. Is that something that could be on the table?
Well, first of all, let me appreciate that asking the question as an economist and not a Senate parliamentarian, because that's complicated. The economics are actually pretty simple. The minimum wage is one of these policies that very much has its intended effect of raising the pay of low-wage workers with a minimal amount of job loss on the other side. That's not to say that that there are no folks who may lose hours initially, and this is something the Congressional Budget Office found. But when they get a new job, because there's lots of turnover in the low-wage labor market, they do so at a higher wage. So if we want to make sure that the millions of essential workers in this country are getting paid a fair wage, we have to raise the minimum wage, which is stuck at $7.25 in too many states throughout this country. So this is a simple policy that does the economics right.
Okay, I suspect we'll see it again. Okay, thanks so much to Jared Bernstein. He's a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. And this is Bloomberg.